They called him the Black Messiah of the Pacific. For 3 years after World War II ended, Japanese soldiers hid in the jungle, refusing to believe the war was over. Hundreds died trying to convince them. But when this one black man walked into that jungle, everything changed. This is his story. August 15th, 1945. The war was over. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radios across Japan, announcing surrender for the first time in the nation's history. In cities across America, people danced in the streets. Sailors kissed strangers in Times Square. Mothers wept with relief that their sons would finally come home. The deadliest conflict in human history had ended. Except it hadn't. Not for everyone. Scattered across hundreds of islands in the Pacific Ocean, thousands of Japanese soldiers remained hidden in caves, in jungles, in the dark places where sunlight barely reached. They heard the announcements. They saw the leaflets dropped from American planes. They read the words declaring the war was over, that Japan had surrendered, that they could finally go home. And they didn't believe a single word of it. To them, it was all a trick, an elaborate American deception designed to lure them out of hiding so they could be captured and humiliated. Death before dishonor. That was the code they lived by. The code they were willing to die for. The Bushido Code wasn't just a set of rules. It was a way of life. A philosophy that had been drilled into these men since childhood. Surrender was the ultimate shame, worse than death itself. A warrior who surrendered brought dishonor not just upon himself, but upon his family, his ancestors, his entire bloodline. These men had been told that Americans would torture them, that they would parade them through streets like animals, that death in battle was the only honorable end to a soldier's life. So they stayed hidden. They survived on jungle plants and rainwater. They built elaborate camouflaged shelters. They watched and waited, convinced that one day the emperor would send ships to rescue them and the war would begin again, and people died because of it. Local villagers who stumbled upon their hiding places, farmers working their fields, children playing too far from home. The holdout soldiers, starving and desperate, sometimes raided villages for food. Sometimes they killed anyone who saw them, terrified that their position would be revealed. The war was over, but the dying continued. Month after month, year after year, the American military tried everything they could think of. They flew planes over the jungles, dropping thousands of leaflets in Japanese explaining that the emperor had surrendered, that the war was truly over. The soldiers thought they were fake. They sent Japanese American soldiers, men who spoke the language perfectly, who tried to reason with the holdouts. The hidden soldiers thought they were traitors or actors, Americans disguised to fool them. They even flew in family members from Japan, mothers and fathers who stood at the edge of jungles and called out their sons' names, begging them to come home. Some of the soldiers believed their own parents were actors hired by the Americans. 12 men died trying to reach one particular group of holdouts on a remote island in the Philippines. 12 men who thought they could talk sense into soldiers who had been living in the jungle for 3 years, who were half starved and completely convinced that surrender meant death and eternal shame. The military was running out of options. They were running out of patience. And they were running out of people willing to walk into that jungle knowing they might never walk out. That's when someone suggested trying something different. Someone nobody expected. Someone who understood what it meant to fight for a country that didn't always fight for you. Someone who knew about honor and dignity, and what it meant to hold your head high even when the world told you to bow down. His name was Major James Robinson, and he was about to do something that military historians would study for decades. James Robinson grew up in Georgia in the 1920s, which means he grew up understanding exactly what it meant to be treated as less than human in your own country. He attended segregated schools, drank from separate water fountains, sat in the back of buses and the balcony of movie theaters. He watched his father work 3 jobs to keep food on the table and still get called boy by white men half his age. But Robinson was brilliant. He had a gift for languages that his teachers noticed early on. He could pick up new words, new sounds, new ways of thinking faster than anyone they'd ever seen. When World War II broke out, Robinson enlisted despite everything, despite the segregation, despite the discrimination, despite knowing that even in uniform, he would face racism from his own fellow soldiers. He served in the Pacific, and somewhere along the way, something clicked in his mind. He started learning Japanese, not just the language, but the culture, the history, the philosophy. He read everything he could get his hands on about Japanese military tradition, about the samurai code, about what honor meant in a culture so different from his his own. By 1947, Robinson was one of the few black officers in the US military who spoke fluent Japanese and understood the cultural context behind the words. When the military was desperately searching for anyone who might be able to reach these holdout soldiers, Robinson's name came up, not because anyone thought he would succeed. Honestly, most people thought it was a suicide mission, but Robinson volunteered anyway. He had an idea, a theory about what these soldiers needed to hear, and who they needed to hear it from. Robinson spent months preparing. He didn't just study the Japanese language or military protocol, he researched the specific soldiers he was going to face. He learned their names, their backgrounds, where they came from in Japan, what their families did for a living. He studied their commanding officer's military record, his hometown, his personal philosophy. Robinson understood something that everyone else had missed. These men weren't crazy. They weren't irrational. They were doing exactly what they had been trained to do, what their culture and their code demanded of them. You couldn't force them to surrender. You had to give them permission to come home. In the fall of 1947, Robinson walked into that Philippine jungle alone. No backup, no weapons, just a satchel full of letters and photographs and a head full of Japanese phrases that he had practiced 1,000 times. The military brass thought he was insane. His fellow officers tried to talk him out of it, but Robinson insisted. He said if he brought soldiers with him, the holdouts would see it as an ambush. If he carried a weapon, they would see it as a threat. He needed to come as a messenger, not as an enemy. He needed to show them that he trusted them with his life. The jungle was dense and humid, the kind of place where sound gets swallowed up by vegetation, and you can't see more than a few feet in any direction. Robinson walked slowly, calling out in Japanese, not demanding surrender, not threatening consequences, just talking, introducing himself, explaining why he was there. He used specific phrases about duty and honor, about completing one's mission, about the respect owed to warriors who had served faithfully. He talked about how sometimes the hardest part of being a soldier isn't fighting, it's knowing when the fight is truly over. The Japanese soldiers had been watching him from the moment he entered their territory. They had guns trained on him, fingers on triggers, ready to fire if this was a trap, but something made them hesitate. Maybe it was the fact that this man was black, which confused them because their propaganda had told them that America was a white man's army. Maybe it was the way he spoke Japanese, not haltingly or with an accent, but fluently, respectfully, using the proper formal language for addressing military officers. Or maybe it was simply that he came alone, unarmed, which was either the bravest thing or the stupidest thing they had ever seen. They didn't shoot, they listened. Robinson talked about their emperor. He talked about how Emperor Hirohito himself had given the order to stop fighting, how the emperor needed his soldiers to come home now because Japan needed to rebuild. He explained that their families had been waiting for years, not knowing if they were alive or dead. He showed them photographs that had been taken recently in Japan, showing cities being rebuilt, showing life continuing. He showed them letters from Japanese generals, official documents with authentic seals that couldn't be faked. But more than anything, he talked to them about honor. This was Robinson's genius. He didn't treat surrender as defeat. He reframed it as the completion of their mission. He explained that their duty had been to fight when the emperor commanded them to fight, and now their duty was to return when the emperor commanded them to return. There was no shame in following orders. The shame would be in disobeying the emperor's direct command to come home. He told them that they had already proven their courage, their loyalty, their commitment. Nobody doubted their honor, but honor also meant knowing when to sheath your sword. The commanding officer of the holdout group finally stepped forward. His name was Captain Nakamura, and he had been living in that jungle for 3 years, watching his men slowly starve, slowly lose hope, slowly die. He looked at Robinson for a long time. Here was an American officer, a black man who by all rights should have hated everything Japanese after years of fighting in the Pacific. And yet this man had walked into his camp alone, had spoken to him with respect, had offered him a way to end this nightmare without losing everything he believed in. Nakamura asked Robinson questions, hard questions. He asked how he could trust that the documents were real, that the war was truly over, that they wouldn't be executed if they surrendered. Robinson answered every question honestly. He admitted that he didn't know what would happen to them after they surrendered. He couldn't promise them anything except that they would be treated according to the rules of war, that they would be processed as prisoners and eventually sent home to Japan. But he also said something that changed everything. He said, "I give you my word word as a soldier, and my word is all I have. A black man in 1947 America giving his word to Japanese soldiers who had been trying to kill Americans for years. It was absurd. It was unprecedented. It was exactly what needed to happen because Nakamura understood something in that moment. He understood that Robinson knew what it meant to fight for honor in a world that didn't always honor you back. He understood that this man had walked into a situation where he could die, where he probably should have died, because he believed in something bigger than revenge or victory. He believed in dignity, in the inherent worth of human beings, even enemy soldiers starving in a jungle. Robinson proposed a ceremony, not a surrender, but a formal conclusion to their service. The Japanese soldiers would emerge from the jungle in full military formation. If they still had uniforms, they would be allowed to carry their weapons until they reached a designated point where they would lay them down with full military honors. There would be salutes. There would be recognition of their service. They would not be marched out as prisoners. They would walk out as soldiers completing their final mission. 3 days later, it happened. 34 Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle where they had been hiding for 3 years. They were thin, their uniforms were tattered, some of them could barely walk, but they marched in formation. Captain Nakamura led them, his sword still at his side. At the designated point, they stopped. They bowed to each other. They saluted their commander one last time, and then slowly, with tears streaming down their faces, they laid down their weapons. Robinson stood at attention and saluted them, saluted enemy soldiers, saluted men who had killed Americans, because he understood that in that moment, they weren't enemies anymore. They were just soldiers finally going home. The military was stunned. 12 men had died trying to reach these holdouts. Months of effort had failed, and Robinson had walked in alone and walked out 3 days later with all 34 soldiers surrendering peacefully. Nobody could quite believe it. They immediately sent Robinson to other islands, to other groups of holdout soldiers. He repeated his success again and again. He saved hundreds of lives, both Japanese soldiers and the local civilians who had been living in fear of them. He became known among the holdouts as someone who could be trusted, someone who understood honor. But here's the part that should make you angry. Here's the part that shows you exactly what was wrong with the world back then and what's still wrong with it today. Major James Robinson came home to an America where he still couldn't eat at the same lunch counter as white soldiers, where he still had to use separate bathrooms, where he could save hundreds of enemy lives with nothing but courage and cultural understanding, but couldn't get served at restaurants in his own hometown. He had shown honor to Japanese soldiers because he believed all men deserved dignity, and his own country couldn't extend him the same courtesy. Robinson's story was buried for decades. You won't find him in most history books. You won't find statues of him or monuments commemorating what he did. His story got footnoted, minimized, forgotten, because America in the 1940s and 50s wasn't interested in celebrating black heroes, because the narrative of World War II was supposed to be about white American soldiers saving the world, not about a black officer from Georgia who understood that empathy could be more powerful than firepower. But his legacy lives on in every hostage negotiator who uses cultural understanding to save lives, in every diplomat who knows that respect and dignity can open doors that weapons cannot, in every person who understands that your enemy is still a human being with a family and a culture and beliefs that matter to them just as much as yours matter to you. Robinson showed the world that you don't end conflicts by dehumanizing the other side. You end them by recognizing their humanity, even when, especially when, they're trying to kill you. There's a lesson here that goes way beyond one man walking into a jungle in 1947. The lesson is that we are all more alike than we are different, that honor and dignity and respect are universal languages, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is extend your hand to someone who has every reason to refuse it. Robinson could have hated those Japanese soldiers. God knows he had reason enough, but he chose to see them as men trapped by circumstance and code, men who needed a way out that wouldn't destroy everything they believed in, and in seeing their humanity, he saved their lives. Major James Robinson saved hundreds of lives with nothing but respect, knowledge, and courage. But I bet you never heard his name in any history class, did you? That's exactly why this channel exists. If this story moved you, if it made you think, then share it, post it, talk about it, because heroes like Robinson deserve to be remembered. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me, what other forgotten black heroes should I cover next? History tried to bury these stories. We're digging them back up. I'll see you in the next one. Stay blessed, stay curious, and keep learning your history.